Hello. We appreciate you joining us this Wednesday afternoon. You never know when a storm, or in my case, when I was a librarian, an electrical short might cause a service disruption at your library. So today, TLC's Chief Technology Officer, Justin Duewel-Zahniser, got that right. We'll discuss how a robust continuity plan can keep your library operational during extreme weather events, cybersecurity events, and other service disruptions. By the way, don't worry, my library was fine. So before I pass it to Justin, I'll just mention a few housekeeping items. First, we are recording, so if you want to share this with your colleagues or watch it again, the recording will be available on our website starting tomorrow. But since you're joining us live, you have the opportunity to ask questions. So please feel free to use our Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation. So without further ado, Justin, welcome to Webinar Wednesday.
All right, thank you. Yes, and I promise when we put this together that we were not thinking about the impending Hurricane Helene, but it is on its way. So if you need to leave the webinar partway through to start hauling buckets of water, by all means, safety first. All right, let's get into this. So continuity planning, and this is going to be oversimplified because this is a webinar. So there's, a little bit of a limit on what we can do here. But we wanted to talk about this. I'll kind of get into the details of the topic based on some feedback from previous webinars. This is really all about creating a plan for keeping critical services running during an emergency situation, and really thinking about and establishing acceptable timeframes for resuming services in an emergency, and coming up with a plan to maximize the odds of getting things back online in that acceptable time frame. This is really an adaptation of a general concept in business called business continuity planning, something we at TLC do, many other businesses do. And in the business world, that's really oriented on kind of being honest, the financial survival of the business during emergencies. How can we get services back online that have SLAs and things like that? And obviously the customer service aspect of that is really important, but those things are all intrinsically tied together. So we're going to talk about that today. And one thing, I know there's been a lot of discussion and debate about, particularly around the pandemic. Not going to wade into, which services of libraries are essential or critical and which aren't, and all that kind of stuff. That's probably beyond me. But there is this sort of general context of how critical are library services, how important are circulations during an earthquake or something, to be a little bit hyperbolic there. But some things to think about, and this comes up when we're interacting with our customers and planning, is one thing I'm sure we'll all agree on is that libraries do a ton more than everyone thinks about. That's a common theme. Everybody just thinks books, and that's barely scratches the surface, although it's certainly an important part of libraries. So something some of our customers and people we've talked to in the library world do, and that are worth thinking about here, is some libraries are also cooling centers, warming centers, storm shelters, other type of shelter sites. Some libraries out there are providing medical equipment and even specific medical services. There's services for special needs populations. So there's a lot going on there. And one thing I like to think about as well is, a lot of libraries have highly unique and therefore very valuable and hard to replace local collections or unique collections. And those are things to think about as well. And then just a little bit tongue-in-cheek here, if you don't think library services are important in an emergency, just imagine what your community would look like and how hard it will be to keep everyone sane without access to the internet for several days. Just imagine that, sort of zombie horror film scenario. So one thing that just wanted to throw out here as we go along is always interested to know, share in chat if you're interested, what critical services your library offers, and bonus points if it's interesting or unusual there. And this is just me taking advantage of the webinar to find out things that I think are interesting. But yeah, if you feel motivated, please share. So continuity planning, so this is kind of the big picture of what continuity planning looks like. And we're going to talk about a couple main points here, really the first three: risk assessment, impact analysis, the development of the continuity plan itself. There's another piece here, succession plan. We're not going to cover that today. This is fairly straightforward. If you have a critical role and you have the staffing level to support this, it's good to have somebody who is trained or can be trained or is in the wings to take over that critical role when needed. That's fairly straightforward, and that is largely constrained by, budget and staffing levels and things like that, depending on your type of library and context. And then the fifth one, that's a good old Kaizen. That is the continuous improvement: review, iterate, improve, test, and so on. And we'll just cover that very briefly in closing thoughts, because that is fairly straightforward as well. So really going to focus in interest of time today on the risk assessment, impact analysis, and continuity plan. So I mentioned, why this topic, and we've definitely gotten some feedback from past popular, highly attended webinars on disaster recovery, ransomware, things we've done in this series to do basically more of this, please. So we're, taking a look at other topics in this area. Maybe this is too far over the line, less useful than the others, et cetera. We love your feedback on each presentation in the series in general as to whether things are tracking in a more useful direction for you. Then the other point here is, case in point, current events. A lot of discussion about the increasing frequency of extreme weather events. And definitely conversations we've had impacting our prospects and customers, particularly in North America and Asia Pacific region. And I'll do a couple examples here. Some of these from different time frames, but just to highlight that point. I'll mention the listserv later in the presentation, but here's an example back from Hurricane Dorian of outreach we do in advance for customers preparing for specific events. We've done some of that related to Helene as well. I have an operational update. I've blanked out the customer name here. Operational update about a recent meeting that was rescheduled due to hurricane preparation. And then on the bottom right there, this is a super typhoon Gami representation. That was off the coast of the Philippines, which affected some TLC customers in a pretty big way as well. And we've had some dialogue with some of them about, emergency preparation and response and how the vendor fits into that and that sort of thing. So just wanted to put some context around that. I guess I could maybe update this to a Helene tracker, but that might be a little too present. So let's start out with risk assessment. And the key here is that the first step to this is really to identify the critical processes and functions in your department. And I put department in quotes there. That's more kind of the business terminology. So for us, department is like information technology, support, development. In your context, you may use the terminology department, but this is going to be more like your youth services, adult services, technical services, IT functions. Typically in school districts, the school customers and partners we talk to there, this is assessed more at like the district level than individual school level. So this will vary a little bit, but it's really all about identifying the things that you consider critical. And it's really focused, as you'll see, we're highlighting process and function here. This isn't really focused on assets or resources like, lighting and heating is critical. This is focused on what people need to be able to do to provide those services, and the rest are kind of dependencies or requirements. So we'll get into how that breaks down. And I'll show you a little bit of what a highly simplified, exerted, redacted, et cetera, risk assessment could look like. This is kind of roughly the way we plan it out. This is a sort of like fake example, but and we'll go through different pieces of this, so don't get overwhelmed by the big old matrix here. But that team or department piece is really, that's where you're going to have what area is this process or function in, and then the process and critical function is the other piece. So for us, we're paying attention to like if our accounts receivable process is in an emergency situation, then we have potential cash flow impact. On down the line, you can sort of see the examples here. So this is like an illustrative, semi-realistic example, but the keys here are the team, the process, and the critical function. Some notes about what's impacted. Notes are always useful. And then the rest of that is really, this is going to be highly tailored. But some of this is, really laying out the dependencies and requirements. So what things need to be working, or put the other way, what things, when they're not working, make it impossible to perform this critical process and function. And then we'll get into the likelihood and severity in detail shortly. So this is kind of what it looks like to think through the process and critical function piece. And again, this is in a business context, but I think the concepts here are pretty straightforward and fairly easy to adapt. So talking about the impact analysis piece, once we've gone through all of our critical processes and functions, and we've edited it down to everybody thinks the coffee machine is highly critical, but once we get down to nuts and bolts, we can agree it's not. So you get that down to your critical processes and functions. The next thing you're really trying to do in this impact analysis is figure out how much downtime is acceptable for each of these critical processes and functions. And then, as I showed on that previous chart, what are the requirements and dependencies? So key thing when thinking about dependencies here is focus on internal and external. And to some degree, the external ones are even more important. So it's not just like who in the library provides service X or is responsible for service X, but like who processes payroll for the library. That could be at the county level, city level, district level, that varies widely. On what funding sources, grants and donations, do critical services depend, and what are their requirements? There's a fair amount to think through there, but the key thing is not just inside your walls, but external dependencies as well. And a best practice here is don't waste time on anything that has built-in redundancy. So case in point, I like to use, we at TLC are heavy, extensive users of Slack, which was one of those technologies that we had been using long before the pandemic, but really came into its own during that period. And so, I get reports I think it's monthly, about just the crazy volume of communication that happens on that channel throughout the business. And so you look at that and you say, wow, this is really important to our communications. But we really wouldn't focus on that heavily in terms of impact analysis, because in a pinch, we could use email, we could use our other chat platforms, we could use our Google tools, we could pick up a phone. It turns out those things still exist. So sorry to anybody who might have joined this webinar from the Slack Corporation, but that's an example of something where when you really think through this, you can take those things off the list and not focus on them because you have a pretty readily available plan B. And it doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to work. That's kind of the key for an emergency situation. So let's take a little bit of a look at how the risk assessment piece works out here. And this is the table that we actually use as a lookup for all of our kind of critical processes and functions. And I'll come back to what I mean by lookup here. But one thing that I have experienced at many different organizations that I've worked for is you can get totally lost in the weeds, agonizing over these subjective definitions. Is this low? Is this medium? Is this high risk? A best practice here is to put some kind of table together like this. If you're a nerd like me, you might think this looks like a Punnett square. Shout out to anyone who knows what a Punnett square is. But the idea here is that you can input the likelihood, which everybody can generally agree on, and the severity, which everyone can generally agree on, and let it calculate which classification you're putting this into. So when we're going through all our analysis here, we basically have to just say, how likely is this? Fairly objective. And is this going to be really bad, not that bad, or like we'll be fine? And put those two things together, and your plan tells you how severe they are. So that's a really good way to make this, I think, a lot cleaner and a lot more straightforward. And it makes it easy to update over time too. If you think, okay, the likelihood of this risk occurring has gone up or down, you just tweak that and everything's recalculated for you. So that's a very, very good approach. Okay, so let's talk about the third portion of this here. And this is the continuity plan itself. And I'll go through a couple examples here to illustrate this, but these are your strategies to resume those critical functions within acceptable timeframes. So we figured out all the things that we think, these are the things that are really important to have a plan to maintain when something occurs, the service that we're providing. We've gone through how critical they are. Now we're thinking about those acceptable timeframes. So this is, okay, this service is fine to be down for an hour, but it really needs to be back up in an hour, or a day, or a week, or a month, or whatever that is. And the key thing here is that that time frame is the time frame that matters to you, and whoever you're providing that service to, and really nobody else. So if you're thinking about this and you think, okay, we have a plan here, and the plan is to get this back in 3 weeks, and that feels like a lot of time. Hey, if that's your acceptable time frame, that's what it is, and that's what you should plan towards. Now, obviously, for SLAs and things in the business world, most of our timeframes are much tighter than that, but that totally varies by service, and that's fine as well. So I'm going to jump into some examples here and talk about emergency power. So this is a big one, generally applicable, and this is a big one that we think about quite a bit. So one of the things that we use for emergency power redundancy at our office location, headquarters location, is a strategy based on a diesel generator, which is pretty common. A lot of data centers use these, primary, secondary, a lot of redundancy there as well. So, the diesel generator, basically its job is when you lose power from the power company, you use the diesel generator for whatever its capacity run period of time is to provide power, bridge power for your critical systems. So, if you think about this, you need to have a working generator. It needs to be in good mechanical condition and with adequate fuel levels. So typically that's all part of a maintenance service contract. Somebody comes out regularly, does mechanical service, checks all the parts, et cetera, make sure fuel levels are topped up. That's kind of a key part of it. But if you stop there, you're missing something really important. And this is going to illustrate a big point about that testing cycle. To meet our acceptable time frame for critical processes and functions relying on power at this specific location, that strategy really means that none of that means anything in practice if this system doesn't successfully cut over power to the generator, right? And I'm not going to go into the electrical weeds on here because it's not very interesting and I'm not an electrician, but it stands to reason all of the work we put into maintaining that, keeping the fuel levels up, having a strategy for this, making sure that this thing can provide enough power for the time frame we need to cover the things that are going to rely on it. None of that means anything if the emergency situation comes around, we cut the power over, and that transfer fails, right? So an example of a key element for the continuity plan is this constant scheduled testing. So the way that we manage this, and I think this sort of illustrates how to think about this thing, is we actually have a process where on a routine schedule, in off-hour events and specific times, we do a primary power cut test where we cut the power, same thing that would happen in the emergency we're planning for there, and then verify with battery backup units covering the cutover gap that the full power successfully transfers for all those critical systems that our staff relies on to the generator, and there's no loss of primary services. And the key thing here, just to repeat a point that I made earlier, is the way to think about this is the worst possible time to figure out that your fancy generator doesn't work in practice is in the middle of that emergency, right? You want to figure that out ahead of time. So the big takeaway here is, we've talked a bit about figuring out those critical processes and functions, figuring out the severity and likelihood, all the dependencies, and then saying, how long can this be down? You need to make sure that when you put a plan together for those things, that you can exercise and test the right components of them to make sure that you're going to be able to rely on that plan when the emergency actually occurs. You don't want to be testing it for the first time when you really need to be able to rely on it. And I think that's a very important point. Throughout the old Dwight D. Eisenhower test quote there that I'll probably butcher this, but no plan ever succeeds or doesn't succeed according to the plan, but it never succeeds without a plan. I definitely butchered that. Sorry, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Another piece that I want to talk about here, and this is especially important to us as a vendor, is the vendor relationship. And so a couple things to say here, if you're a TLC customer in particular, some things that we ask you to do. So if you're joining as an existing customer here, some things to call out is, we track in our system an emergency contact, which is slightly different from like a billing contact or a primary informational contact. Could be the same person, could be different, could be multiple people. But we maintain records of the folks to specifically reach out to in certain types of emergency situations. And we always ask that you help us keep that up to date. So establish it initially, and as that changes, staffing changes, responsibility changes, whatever happens over time, that you help us keep that up to date. We also have a mailing list. I showed an excerpt earlier of emergency prep information, extra contact information, tips and tricks related to extreme weather events. That kind of stuff happens on the mailing list, sometimes from us to customers, a lot of times from customer to customer. And so it's good to make sure that if you aren't aware of that, that key staff join that mailing list. If you're on-premise, meaning you're a TLC customer, but you run your own servers, you run our software on your equipment locally, a couple things to think about there. One, always consider going to the hosted option. That takes something that you would be responsible for in an emergency and puts all the planning on us, which is something that we have kind of more resources to do than a lot of libraries. Not all of them, but certainly a lot of them. So that can limit the scope of what you need to plan for in a useful way. Another possibility short of that is if you're running locally and you're doing all your backups locally, we do have a service where on a schedule you can send us a backup and we'll do a full evaluation that backup is clean and can be used to restore services to help you, get some kind of peace of mind and assurance there, but also that, brings over a copy that can be kind of kept as a temporary archive offsite as well. So some useful value there. If you're a hosted customer, the good news is I don't have much to tell you. There's a lot less to worry about here. The main thing there is keeping those contacts up to date for speed of communication or coordination if we need to jump in and assist you with something. And then, of course, if you're not a TLC customer, bad news is I can't tell you much to do, but hopefully this gives you some idea engaging with your own vendors as to kinds of things to consider or ask about or plan out there. So quick poll here, just curious about this. We'll put a poll up here. Does your library system have some kind of continuity plan already? And your options there are yes, no, or unsure. And if you're like, well, I have a plan, but I don't know that everybody is totally read into it, or I'm not sure it's that thorough or whatever, I would recommend the unsure option there. So we'll leave that up here for a bit, give you an opportunity to respond to that. And this is really a curiosity for how much this has permeated.
Yeah, it looks like it looks like a pretty good split. Yes and unsure. So
Okay.
yeah, it seems pretty evenly split. It's a good
Yeah,
sign.
okay. There's some poll psychology in this because yes and unsure are the right answers because no means you've checked and found out that there isn't one. And that is a lot less likely than unsure. So it's good feedback for us doing our polls in the future there. A
Yeah.
little bit of multiple choice test psychology thrown in.
And one thing I remember from my time as a librarian was the city IT department had a continuity plan, and because they were sort of in charge of everything, we really didn't have to worry about the service disruption, more the, oh no, the power went out because of the electrical short. Let's call the fire department and see if we can get back on. So we were lucky in that regard, but I know that not every library has that kind of that offered to them. So
Yep. Great. Okay. Appreciate the responses there. I'm going to jump in here to some final thoughts based on timing here. So we leave a little bit of time for Q&A. Couple things that I want to stress here. The first one, don't overplan. Focus your efforts on the most probable, highest impact things. And this really leads into the next point, incrementalism, which is like, this is a case where thinking about this and putting a plan together, the whole is basically the sum of the parts here, right? So if you have a very thought out half a plan for your critical stuff, you're half of the way to everything you want, and you've done the most important half. So it's best to start focusing on the things that are, again, most probable, highest impact, get those nailed down, practice and say, we're good to go there, and then move on to the less probable or less severe stuff. Don't make the perfect the enemy of the good on this. The next point, it just says 0 crossed out. You are not trying to get all risk to 0 here. The key thing is to not, beat yourself up and spend too much energy on things that you really don't have much control on. The focus here is really being more aware of the risks you have and having a plan already put together so that when the time comes, you don't waste spin up time, when time is of the essence, trying to figure out what to do. So it's really not about avoiding all risk. It's about planning for it, right? Realism is a factor here too. So again, about beating yourselves up. Everybody's limited, in what they can do versus what they would love to do hypothetically if they only had all the budgets and resources. So a key thing here is to focus on places where you have agency. And if it's out of your hands, acknowledge it's out of hands, make sure people know that, and move on. You want to know what you would do about it under those circumstances, but you don't want to spend a lot of time and energy trying to solve a problem that you can't really solve. And then, as I really stressed in the example, talking about kind of the generator and the backup power strategy there. This is where I actually wrote down in the speaker notes the accurate Dwight Eisenhower quote. I'm not going to repeat that again. But the key thing here is that a smaller plan that you've actually tested and worked through and verified is way better than a bigger plan that you've never actually tried out. So the key thing here, especially on the critical stuff, is really get through to, whatever exercise means, depending on your plan and the acceptable time frame there. But the key thing is to work through that, even if it's just a simulation, to make sure that you can rely on that. And then the last piece here is don't reinvent the wheel. So showed some examples of resources here. The value that you're going to put into this is what goes into the plan, not the structure of the plan, because this is a fairly common, thing. As I said, a lot of businesses, organizations do. So one thing to check into, and Ash alluded to this a bit, is, does your library, system, district, state, whatever, already have a plan that you can adopt or adapt as needed? There may be some standards in place that you can pick up and use there that will save you some time and effort. And then, there's definitely resources available online to help with this, both generally and specifically in the context of libraries. Now, I don't think that it's a good idea for us to tell you, you should go use this plan, and then, you have issues during your emergency or whatever. That's not really our role here. So we're not going to endorse any specific thing, but just know that there's a lot of resources out there that you can take a look at and make use of. And then, yes, I'm going to end my portion of the presentation here.
thank you so much. We're going to just pop up a little last second poll and just see if you're interested in learning a little bit more about TLC and what we do. And while that's up, I'm just going to read. We have one question which is a really good question, I think. It's our library has an old-ish continuity plan. How often do you update yours? And should be,
Yes.
and then every
Um,
year or?
that is a great question. So, if a good thing to note is that the plan itself should recommend how often it should be updated. So once you figure this out, I'll answer your question, but once you figure this out, I recommend putting in the plan what the schedule to review and update it is, because then you'll never have this problem again. Just a little tip there. But generally, and this varies by organization, but generally annually is a good target because if you look at it quarterly, again, in some parts of the business world, this changes. But if you look at it quarterly, generally you're going to spend time and not change much very frequently. Less than annually, the services you offer, things like that have changed significantly. So annually is really the sweet spot there in terms of level of effort. Now, your mileage may vary, adjust as needed, but I would recommend, focus on once a year. That tends to be the right level, or at least the right level to start at, and put it in the plan. This is the trigger when we do this annually, or at least when we start organizing the process to do it annually. Yeah, fantastic question. Absolutely.
All right. So that's all we have for questions. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And Justin, thank you for the wealth of information. If you want to catch a replay of this webinar, it'll be available tomorrow, starting at tomorrow at tlcdelivers.com/webinar. We have several webinars coming up. Next, our next webinar is on spookifying your pack, how to make your LS2 pack or your Carl Connect Discovery pack look fresh for the holidays. So please join us, and thank you again so much for joining us here on Webinar Wednesday. Have a great afternoon.